And then he moved on to other things. A lot of people are noticing the great similarity between that and what has come to be seen as Pascal's wager. Blaise Pascal, the 17th century mathematician, philosopher, and theologian, who at one point in his Pensées seems to go into a risk-reward calculation about faith. And even though that Blaise Pascal never did it like this, sometimes it's sort of set up as a 2x2 grid, and you've got, imagine that you wager on God and he doesn't exist. Well, you haven't lost very much. There's nothing after death. And you've given up a Sunday going to Mass. But the risk is low, and the possible reward is very high, because if God exists and you do wager on him, then you have won infinitely. Now, if you don't wager on God and God doesn't exist, well, once again, you haven't lost very much. But finally, here is the massive risk. If God does exist and you haven't wagered on him, you could lose infinitely. And so, if this is the risk-reward calculation, what should you do? You should wager on God. Now, in the popular imagination, what Pascal wrote in the 17th century has been reinterpreted quite significantly for the modern day, and it's been given a kind of a hyper-Protestant spin as well, because what it means to wager on God has become, in the popular imagination, simply making some kind of profession of faith, some kind of deathbed conversion, whereas Blaise Pascal was a Catholic, a Jansenist. He was not thinking in those terms. But it seems like Scott Adams has picked up that kind of form of Pascal's wager and run with it. And the first question I want to ask and answer in this video is this Pascal's wager? And my answer to that first question is no, that's not what Pascal was talking about originally. We had an expert on Blaise Pascal on the channel, Bishop Graham Tomlin, who is the author of Blaise Pascal, the Man Who Made the Modern World. I got him to explain what Pascal meant in the 17th century. Here's what he says.
And the way the wager works is like this. One of the things that Pascal would do, he had a lot of friends who were into gambling. He kind of then says, well, life is a bit like that. We find ourselves in the middle of life, like the middle of a game, where the outcome is uncertain. We don't know. Is there a God? Is there not a God? After this life is over, do we just go into nothingness, or do we go to eternal bliss, or do we go into something worse, which is, eternal torment and so on? We don't know, he says. And so then he sits down and says, well, okay, well, it's, he's having a conversation with someone. I think the wager would have been in the form of a conversation. And he poses this question. He says, there's a coin being tossed at the far edge of the universe. It's going to come down head or tails. Which one are you going to bet? Either God exists or God doesn't exist. Heaven or hell. What are you going to go for?
And he actually says, I'm quoting from your own book here on page 325, you say, how will you wager? And then the next sentence he says, reason cannot make you choose either. Reason cannot prove either wrong, which is interesting.
Exactly. That's right. Yeah. So his conversation partner says to him, well, is there, how do I choose? Are there good reasons one way or the other? And he said, well, reason's pretty limited in how he can help you in this regard. So the guy says, well, what do I do? And so Pascal says, well, let's work out the probability. And he goes through a bit of mathematical exploration where he kind of says, well, okay, let's think about it. If you bet that God doesn't exist, and you're right, well, you haven't gained much, you haven't lost much. But if you're wrong, you stand to lose a great deal if you're wrong and God does exist. Whereas he says, if you bet that God does exist, and you're wrong, well, again, you haven't lost a great deal, maybe a little bit of sacrifice in this life, but, then you go into nothingness and that's it. But if you're right, you stand to gain a huge amount, which is you stand to basically win the jackpot, eternal bliss. So he's saying, if you purely go on probability, if you were being entirely rational about it, you would always bet on belief. You'd always bet that God exists because you stand to gain a lot more that way, whereas the other way, you stand to lose a lot more. Anyway, so that's the kind of bit of mathematical reasoning. And then his kind of conversation partner comes back and says, well, yeah, but hang on. I can't just believe something. I can't make myself believe something that I don't. And Pascal says, well, okay, fair enough. I get that. But then he says, this is the killer point, I think. He says, at least get it into your head that the reason you don't believe is not because of your reason, it's because of your passions. In other words, that's what he's driving at. He's trying to get this person to realize why they don't believe. It's not because of their reason. It's not rationality. It's not that they're being properly rational and Christians are being a irrational, faith-based people. It's because they don't want to believe. Because if you were really following reason and probability, you'd always bet on belief.
See, that's the point that Blaise Pascal is misunderstood on. Blaise Pascal is not saying just play a risk-reward calculation and make a deathbed conversion and trick God. He's not really telling you how heaven works or entrance to heaven works. He's really telling you how you work, how your passions and your reason interact. The point of the wager is to say, if you are simply doing a risk-reward calculation, then you'd be in church on a Sunday. You're not in church on a Sunday. That's not largely because you've been clever about it. The clever thing to do would be to give up a Sunday and go to church, and you stand to gain a lot from that risk-reward calculation. But you don't live your life according to a risk-reward calculation, do you? You live your life according to what you want. And Pascal is very much a theologian and a philosopher of the heart. He's famous for saying the heart has its reasons, of which reason knows nothing. We are heart-led creatures who do what we want, largely. And if we don't find ourselves in church on a Sunday morning, it's largely because we don't want to go to church. It's far less that we are these clever Parisian philosophers who have rationally concluded that church is silly. You haven't rationally concluded that church is silly, have you, my fellow mathematician friends, says Blaise Pascal. You haven't concluded that church is silly because of your reason. You have not wanted to go because of your heart. But that's not how Blaise Pascal's wager is considered nowadays. Nowadays, we mischaracterize him and we imagine that he's telling us to do a risk-reward calculation and make a cynical deathbed conversion, and that this is the way to get to heaven. Pascal wasn't really telling you about how you get to heaven. He was telling you about how your heart is already in charge of you. So is Scott Adams doing Blaise Pascal's wager? He is doing a version of Pascal's wager, but it's a version that I'm not sure Blaise Pascal himself would recognize, even if that's the version that has come to be known popularly. By the time Pascal's wager is being considered by modern 21st century YouTubers, it has changed very significantly from what Pascal meant. And that's the second thing that I think Scott Adams is teaching us at this moment. What does our post-Christian de-churched digital age make of death and heaven and hell and faith?